Once upon a time, there lived a nanny whose sole purpose was to destroy the minds of innocent children. A nanny who taught a little boy to call his own mother a prostitute. Her name was Grace, and she worked for one of the richest families in Lagos. Grace looked so innocent and came with excellent recommendations when Mr. and Mrs. Okafor were desperately looking for a living nanny for their only son. Grace checked all their boxes. She was well educated and presented herself as a devoted Christian who feared God. Mr. and Mrs. Okafor were both busy professionals who traveled constantly for work. Because of their tight schedules, they handed over the care of their only son, Chidi, to his nanny. They expected her to raise him properly and teach him good values. That's how Grace entered their lives. She came through an agency that described her as God-fearing, patient, and amazing with kids. When she showed up for the interview, she spoke softly, dressed simply, and smiled in a way that immediately made Mrs. Okafor feel comfortable. Nobody could have imagined that behind that sweet face was a bitterness so deep that she was ready to poison an innocent child's mind. Grace didn't take this job just to work. She took it to settle a score with the world through the most helpless person she could find. Grace didn't look at children with love, especially not children from wealthy families. She believed these kids had everything handed to them on a silver platter while people like her suffered and struggled. Growing up, Grace had worked in many rich homes. In every house, she watched wealthy parents kiss their kids goodbye and come back weeks later with gifts and apologies. She watched nannies do the real parenting while the parents just paid bills and bought toys to cover up their guilt. Over time, something dark grew inside her. She convinced herself that these children were already spoiled, entitled, and didn't deserve what they had. So instead of protecting them, she decided to corrupt them. That's why Grace became a nanny. She told herself she was doing the world a favor. From the very first week in the Okafor household, Grace started her evil work. She never raised her voice. She never looked angry. She always waited until the house was quiet, when the parents were away, when the doors were locked, when Chidi was alone with her. She would sit him on her lap and smile. "Chidi," she would whisper, "do you know some special words?" The boy would shake his head eagerly. "These are words only smart children know," she would say. Big people words. She started small. She taught him to roll his eyes when his parents spoke, to hiss when his mother corrected him, to mutter insults under his breath. Each time he obeyed, she rewarded him with sweets, cartoons, and praise. Soon the words grew darker. She taught him to call his father stupid, to tell his mother she was useless. And one afternoon, laughing softly, she leaned close and said, "If you really want to hurt her, call her a prostitute." Chidi hesitated. Grace's smile disappeared instantly. She grabbed his arm tightly and said in a low, dangerous voice, "If you ever tell anyone I taught you these words, I will teach you a lesson you'll never forget. Do you understand me?" The boy nodded, terrified. From that day, fear kept his mouth shut. What Chidi didn't know was that he wasn't the first. Before him, there had been other children. Rich children. Children who suddenly became rude, defiant, and hateful toward their parents. In every house, Grace stayed just long enough to plant her poison. Then she moved on when people started getting suspicious. She always presented herself as prayerful. She quoted Bible verses. She fasted. She cried during family prayers. Parents trusted her because she wore holiness like a costume. Slowly, Chidi began to change. He insulted his parents casually. He laughed when his mother cried. He spoke to his father with contempt. Each time his parents tried to correct him, Grace would whisper to him later, "See, I told you they hate you. But I'm the one who truly loves you." The house that once had laughter became tense and cold. Mrs. Okafor cried herself to sleep many nights, wondering where she went wrong. Mr. Okafor blamed stress, school, cartoons, anything but the nanny, until one day, Chidi slipped up. In anger, he shouted an insult his mother had never heard before. Word for word, exactly how Grace had taught him. When Mrs. Okafor asked who taught him such a word, Chidi hesitated for a brief moment, his eyes darting nervously before he quickly lied. "I heard it in a movie," he said. Mrs. Okafor's heart sank. She immediately called Grace into her room and repeated what Chidi had said. Without asking more questions, she made a strict rule. From that day on, Chidi was banned from watching any movie that wasn't made strictly for children. Cartoon channels only. No adult films, no random YouTube videos. Grace bowed her head and nodded obediently, pretending to agree. But inside, she smiled because she knew the truth. Movies were never the problem. The poison was already sitting in the house, wearing the face of a trusted nanny. From that day on, Grace became more careful. She knew the parents were now watching, but they still weren't watching her. So she changed her tactics. Grace stopped using obvious insults and started using suggestions. She would tell Chidi that his mother talked too much. She would roll her eyes whenever Mr. Okafor gave instructions and mutter that rich men think money gives them sense. Slowly, she taught him that disrespect didn't always mean bad words. Tone, she said, was enough. When Chidi spoke rudely and his parents corrected him, Grace would later pull him aside and say, "They're just jealous that you're smart. Don't mind them." She made him feel superior to his own parents, as if he was wiser than the people who gave birth to him. Weeks passed and Chidi's behavior got worse. He talked back freely, slammed doors, and laughed whenever his parents argued. One evening, Mrs. Okafor broke down in tears after Chidi insulted her again. She asked him gently why he hated her. And for the first time, the boy looked confused. He didn't know why. He only knew that something inside him enjoyed hurting his mother. That night, Mrs. Okafor couldn't sleep. She called her sister, Nkechi, Chidi's godmother and the only person the boy loved even more than his own parents. Nkechi arrived the very next morning to see what was happening. She was calm, observant, and sharp. The kind of woman who noticed what others would normally miss. From the moment she stepped into the house, Grace felt it in her spirit. Something about Nkechi unsettled her deeply. The way she watched Chidi. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way her eyes lingered on Grace, as if she was sensing something everyone else had missed. Nkechi spent time with her godson. She played with him, prayed with him, and gently corrected him when he spoke rudely to his parents. For the first time in months, Chidi began to soften. He laughed freely, hugged his aunt tightly, and Mrs. Okafor couldn't help but notice the transformation. However, Grace could not contain her rage. She noticed how Nkechi never left her nephew alone with her. Nkechi's presence threatened everything she had carefully built, and Grace could not hold back her anger. She could not sit back and watch another woman ruin everything she had worked on for months. So she decided that Nkechi had to go, even if it was the last thing she did. Grace began her evil plot. She told Chidi that she overheard a conversation between his aunt and his mother. They were planning to send him to the village to stay with his grandmother. Grace convinced him that his aunt Nkechi hated him. She told him that Nkechi was only pretending to love him and that the moment she succeeded in turning his parents against Grace, she would convince them to send him far away to the village. Chidi believed the lie and became distant again. He stopped hugging his aunt and began answering her coldly. Nkechi noticed the sudden shift, but instead of reacting, she decided to watch closely. Nkechi knew something was wrong. She saw how Chidi always ran to Grace for everything. In fact, Grace was the only one he never disrespected, and Nkechi couldn't help but wonder why. The realization struck her like thunder. That evening, she decided to confront Grace. Nkechi walked up to Grace in the kitchen and asked why she was the only one Chidi never disrespected. "How can a child disrespect his parents but choose to only be respectful around you?" she asked. Grace stammered for a moment, pretending not to know what she was talking about. Before Nkechi knew what was happening, Grace burst into tears. She began to accuse Nkechi of hating on her. Grace continued to cry loudly, I am a child of God and I will never harm a child, she wailed so loudly that Mrs. Okafor, hearing the commotion, rushed in from the sitting room. Nkechi turned to her sister and tried to convince her that Grace was behind all the terrible things happening. How can we explain the fact that Chidi only respects Grace? She said to her sister, who thought deeply about it. In that moment, Grace said something that shifted the entire accusation. Is it because I caught you sleeping with your brother-in-law that you're trying to get rid of me? She said to Nkechi, who froze in complete shock. What did you just say? Nkechi asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace covered her face and cried even louder. Madam, please ask her. That day you traveled and returned unexpectedly, I heard her telling him that her panties were still in the room. She sobbed dramatically. I was scared to talk, madam. I didn't want to destroy your home. The words landed like a bomb. Mrs. Okafor's legs began to weaken. What room? She asked slowly, her eyes burning. Our bedroom. Mrs. Okafor asked in disbelief. Grace nodded repeatedly, crying harder. Madam, check your room. I swear on my life, I didn't want to talk. But since she's accusing me wrongly, I must speak the truth. Nkechi's mouth fell open. That is a lie, sister, she said firmly. I've never slept with your husband. Mrs. Okafor stomped toward the master bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Nkechi followed closely behind, confused, terrified, praying silently because she knew Grace was up to no good. Mrs. Okafor pulled the sheets roughly, searched the bedside, and then looked under the bed. And there it was, Nkechi's panties, sitting under the bed as if someone had planted them there on purpose. Mrs. Okafor screamed out in anger as she held up the panties and asked her sister what they were doing there. Nkechi staggered back as if she'd been slapped. That's impossible, sister, she whispered. She tried to explain that she had never stepped foot in the master bedroom. I swear to God, sister. This is a setup. Mrs. Okafor ordered her to leave and never return. Get out of my house, she shouted. Get out of my house now. Nkechi packed her bags in tears and left the house. Mrs. Okafor confronted her husband, who denied having anything to do with her sister. However, she didn't believe him because of all the times he had cheated on her in the past. She sent him out of the house, and her husband, not wanting to cause more trouble, left to one of his other properties. Mrs. Okafor apologized to Grace, thanking her for telling the truth. Grace was so excited. She couldn't believe how perfectly her plan worked. For the first time since Nkechi arrived, the house was quiet again. No watchful eyes, no probing questions, no one standing between her and the child she had worked so hard to control. Grace sat on her bed, replaying the events in her mind. Every lie had landed perfectly. Every tear had been timed well, and she couldn't contain her excitement. The next morning, she hugged Chidi tightly and whispered, "See, I told you she hates you. She wanted to send you to the village, but I made your mommy send her away." Chidi thanked her for saving him. Grace decided to take her plan a notch further. She knew her time with them was now limited. She knew the kind of woman Nkechi was. Although she was out of the house, Grace knew Nkechi wouldn't give up that easily. That very day, Grace began to tighten her grip on Chidi's mind. She knew Nkechi would not give up easily. Women like Nkechi always came back with the truth. So Grace told herself that if the child's heart was completely ruined, no truth would ever matter again. She started teaching him worse things, not just insults, but hatred. She sat him down after breakfast and spoke slowly, carefully, like a teacher preparing a final lesson. "Chidi," she said softly, "you know those words I taught you before? Those ones are small. They are baby words." The boy looked up at her, curious. "If you really want to be strong," she continued, "you must never let them think they own you." From that day, she taught him how to curse under his breath. She taught him how to laugh when his mother cried. She taught him how to mock his father's voice and call him a weak man. She told him things no child should ever hear. When mommy is talking, hiss loudly and tell her to shut up. If daddy shouts, Tell him he's useless without money. If they punish you, spit at them so they regret ever punishing you. Chidi slowly became a menace to his parents. Mrs. Okafor watched her son become someone she no longer recognized. He insulted her in public, embarrassed his father in front of visitors, and even laughed when punishments were given. And every time his mother tried to discipline him, Grace would teach him how to rebel. Soon, Chidi no longer just insulted his parents. He despised them. One evening, unable to bear it any longer, Mrs. Okafor sat her son down, her voice trembling. "My son, is it Auntie Grace who is teaching you how to behave like this?" Chidi's face hardened instantly. Instead of answering her question, he scoffed. "Why are you so nosy, Mommy?" he snapped. "You're always desperate for attention." The words pierced his mother's heart like a knife. She staggered back, tears filling her eyes. This was no longer childish rudeness. This was something learned. Heartbroken, she went straight to Grace and complained bitterly about her son's behavior. Grace placed her hand on her chest and sighed. "Madam, don't worry. I will change him. Just trust me. Give me a little time," and Mrs. Okafor did. She began to rely on Grace completely. She bought her expensive clothes. She increased her allowance. She even bought her a beautiful necklace to encourage her and make her take the job seriously. Grace couldn't believe her luck. She began to wear the expensive clothes and necklace, feeling like more than a nanny. Mrs. Okafor noticed the change but decided to keep quiet to see if her plan would work and Grace would finally do some magic to change her son. Months passed, and instead of any improvement, Chidi grew more hostile. Mrs. Okafor, extremely angry, decided to take back all the gifts she gave Grace. She took back everything, claiming that Grace didn't deserve the gift since her son still hadn't changed. Grace was furious. She couldn't believe her madam took away all the expensive things. So she locked herself in her room, thinking about what to do next. Minutes later, Mrs. Okafor marched from her bedroom and found Grace standing in the living room with her bags. She wanted to leave, and Mrs. Okafor stood there shocked to see how serious she was. "I can't work here anymore," Grace said. Mrs. Okafor asked why she decided to leave. Grace went on about how no one appreciated all the work she put into caring for their son. "I took your son like my own, filled in the gap you were all too busy to fill. Then what do I get? Everyone treating me like I mean nothing." Mrs. Okafor asked her what it would take to make her stay. Grace told her madam she had to pay her 1 million naira if she ever wanted her to stay. Mrs. Okafor agreed and told Grace to wait for some minutes for her personal assistant to arrive. Grace couldn't contain her excitement. She sat there like a queen, knowing she now had complete control of the entire situation. Minutes later, the PA arrived, with some police officers. Grace couldn't believe her eyes. She wondered what the officers were doing there. Little did she know that everything was a trap, including the gifts her madam gave her a month ago. Grace had no idea that Mrs. Okafor got her the gift items as a way of secretly discovering the truth. The necklace she gave Grace was a secret recording device that recorded all the terrible things she had taught Chidi. Mrs. Okafor took back the gifts to listen to the recording on the necklace. What she heard, however, shattered her in a way she didn't expect. She overheard Grace coaching her son, planting hatred in his heart toward his parents. She even heard the part where Grace threatened her son never to tell anyone about it or else she would deal with him the way she dealt with his aunt. She heard Grace laugh about how her madam was blind and how rich people never notice when their children are being ruined. Tears streamed down Mrs. Okafor's face as she realized the damage Grace had done to her precious son. Her hands trembled as she played the recording again for Grace to hear. This time, everyone listened as Grace bragged about how easy it was to manipulate children. They heard her mock parents who were too busy chasing money to raise their own children. Mrs. Okafor broke down in front of everyone, not because of the insult, not because of the betrayal, but because she realized how close she had come to losing her own son. The officer stepped forward and informed Grace that she was now under arrest for child abuse, manipulation, blackmail, and false accusation. Grace screamed, cursed, and tried to deny everything, but the recording spoke louder than her lies. As she was dragged away, she turned to Chidi and shouted that his parents would never love him the way she did. Chidi burst into tears as he watched the officers drag her away. His mother, in that moment, saw the extent of damage Grace had done to her son. So she decided to take him to therapy. That was the only way her son would finally get the help he desperately needed. Mrs. Okafor also apologized to her husband and sister, who turned out to be innocent of the accusations against them. She learned her lesson the hard way. Trust without vigilance can destroy a home. The lessons from this story: no matter how busy life becomes, parents must never outsource the heart and mind of their child. Money, gifts, and recommendations cannot replace presence, awareness, and active parenting. Not everyone who appears God-fearing is safe, and not every smile means good intentions. Parents must pay attention to sudden changes in a child's behavior, listen when loved ones raise concerns, and ask hard questions instead of dismissing red flags. Trust must always be balanced with vigilance because evil often hides behind familiarity and a good reputation. Above all, children need consistent love, supervision, and emotional connection from their parents. Because when that space is left empty, someone else will fill it. And not everyone fills it with good.